Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Beyond Second Cognition. I'm Endall Beall. The topic of this discussion is intellect and the ego. I discussed some of this in the Consciousness Advances or Consciousness Evolves, Intellect Doesn't. And I discussed it a bit more in the Voodoo Reality book, and I'm probably going to discuss it more in depth in The Flesh Robot. I wanted to share some insights I got today. Hopefully you'll find them useful. Prior to the advent of Plato and his talking about divine intellect, humans have always had intellect. It's always been an analyzing part of the human form, the human body. Intellect doesn't always work best when it's ignorant. It's hard to reason things out when you don't know things. But where humanity got sidetracked, particularly with the mind virus, is when Plato came up with the idea of the divine intellect. You need to understand that the mind virus could never create anything on its own. All it could do was duplicate what it found in its human hosts through their intellect. The hive virus was not consciousness in any way, shape, or form. It was a mimic, and it could only mimic what was in the form so far as the intellect goes. Human biocomputers were created with intellect to serve as a guidance system. This intellect was coupled with a form of self-identity called the ego, or we call it the ego. What the virus did is it duplicated this ego in a form of mirror image. This mirror image, being insecure, required validation through the eyes of others, and eventually wound up having to deal with a form of self-validation through the false self-image. If you stop and think about self-image and you think about it being a mirror, then it makes perfect sense. So all of us function with this inner mirror of the self-image, which is the reflection of the real personality amplified out of proportion by the virus personality. The virus didn't really have a personality, it just stole your personality and twisted it to its own needs. But if we look at this, and this is something for consideration if you're doing your personal internal work, it's easier to remove external beliefs from the external world than it is to remove our internal beliefs about ourselves based on this false self-image, this mirror reflection, over-amplified ego image. The virus mind, the reflection mind, had to have the validation through the eyes of others. As you go through your clearing process, you're going to get rid of a lot of this need for validation from others to be who you are. But even then, you still have this inner mirror, this self-image, this reflection of yourself. And it's sort of like Narcissus looking in the pool and falling in love with himself. So we've all become attached to this inner self-image. We feel that we have to justify ourselves to sustain this image about how we are, how we define ourselves as an individual. But what happens in this process is the false ego was one mirror, and then the real ego serves as another mirror, and it bounces back and forth in our heads. And we go through this rationalization process, keeping these infinite mirrors bouncing back and forth, the image of the self-image, on one hand fighting to keep the self-image, and on the other hand knowing that we need to get rid of the false self-image. You're not going to get rid of the primary personality ego program. You can't do it, or this machine doesn't function. The human biocomputer doesn't function. So to think that my ego is bad, you have to separate between the two. The false self-image, the mirror image that we feed internally and seek validation externally, that's the ego you need to worry about, not the primary personality unit of the human biocomputer. You're never going to get rid of self-identity. And that's what the primary ego is, not the mirror reflection that Narcissus fell in love with and that we all fall in love with ourselves, justifying our inner mirror image. When you reach a certain stage of development, you'll find that you don't have any positions to defend. You don't have to defend your very existence to anybody in the outside world, and you will eventually learn that you don't have to defend yourself to the false self-image internally. When you have nothing to defend in that respect, then you have nothing to debate or argue with people over or anything else. You'll know what you know, and if people want to accept what you know or not, that's totally up to them. But we go through this process of self-justification, and this is where our internal rationalization process comes in. Oh, I'm not like that. Well, yes, you are. Sometimes people outside ourselves point our habits out to us, and we get all defensive. Well, what are you defending? Are you defending your existence, your ego, your personality for living, breathing, and having life? Or are you defending this false self-image? When Plato brought in the intellect thing, the intellect is supposed to be a navigating tool, but it's not supposed to be the king. By the virus placing the divine intellect above our other sensory perceptions, it made the king out of a slave and made us all slaves to the false king called intellect. Humans have all sorts of extrasensory capacities. By making us believe that intellect was the pinnacle of knowledge and where we should all be, and then it discounted all of our extrasensory capabilities. Oh, those are just myth. That's just superstition, says intellect. And so we've all bought into the lie of the intellect being supreme, when in fact intellect is supposed to be a secondary tool to figure things out when we have perhaps extrasensory insights, if you want to call it that, or tweaks from our consciousness, or visions or concepts or ideas. The intellect is there to secondarily process the ideas we receive through alternate sensory perceptions. But where humanity has sold itself out is they've taken intellect that was supposed to be a tool and turned the tool into the king and discounted everything else. And so we've been slaves to divine intellect, which was nothing but a mirror image of the virus mind, copying the intellect of the human biocomputer. Intellect is not supreme. And until we can get past this attachment with intellect about how smart you are and how much you can dictate back what you've learned by rote, spout out all the stuff you've been taught as your beliefs, then you're controlled by intellect, and you keep intellect on its throne along with the mirror self-image of the narcissistic inner world. We may not all be narcissistic to the outer world, but so far as supporting our inner self-image, yep, we're all narcissists. We're all looking in that mirror, and it's looking back at us, and then we rationalize to keep the false self-image in place. All its habits, all its beliefs about ourselves, all its insecurities, everything. And this is done through intellect, because intellect has to justify its existence. Not being a king, it has to run a scam. So intellect has taken the throne, while all of your other aspects of consciousness, internal insight, PSOYCA sentience, however you want to term it, takes a back seat, and intellect runs the show, except intellect only goes so far. This is why intellect will not take you across that threshold of cognitive awareness. It will keep you chained in and roped down. It will not advance, because intellect has a glass ceiling beyond which it can't transcend. Even the virus couldn't transcend intellect, because to move into higher level consciousness, you have to defeat the false image driven by intellect. You have to shatter the glass ceiling, and you do that by shattering the inner mirror. I know this is kind of weird and twisted and hard to get your heads around, but I'm going to ask you to think about it. Maybe some of you will find some sense in it. I've done my best for an off-the-cuff discussion at 1:30 in the morning. And we'll see what kind of feedback we get as to whether it prompts thoughts and ideas within yourselves. For those of you doing the work, stay the course, don't give up on yourselves.